Your Reverence wrote to me to find out if the blacks who come from Luanda to go on to Cartagena are justly enslaved. I do not believe your Reverence should worry about this. In Lisbon, men of good conscience do not find slavery reprehensible. Father Luis Brandao to Father Alonso de Sandoval, 1611. In 1620, John Rolfe wrote of the arrival of Africans in late August 1619. He used the phrase 20 and odd, but 32 were listed on the first census. 1619 has been circled as a banner year for the history of race in America. 2019 was the 4th anniversary, and it generated lots of reflection and commemoration, but also debate over landing sites, the status of the Africans, the meaning of America, and the state of race relations today. But lost in much of this is that the story should begin not in America, but in Africa. When the subject of the first Africans was first researched in the early 20th century, African American scholars then focused on 1619 as the beginning of a new culture and how African Americans, emphasis on American, were at the beginning and thus always a part of the American experiment. But by the mid-20th century, as scholars, both black and white, gained more interest in the origins of American slavery, it was presumed the 1619 Africans were captured from the Caribbean, not just in the Caribbean, and thus were from various groups and acclimated in Spanish America. It did help to explain the Iberian names of the Africans in the 1620 and 1625 Jamestown musters. Everything changed by the 1980s, when scholars linked the, quote, Dutch men of war, unquote, mentioned by John Rolfe, and a ship called Treasurer that followed a few days later, to an attack on an Iberian slaver in the summer of 1619. Its captain reported being attacked by 2 English pirates who seized nearly 60 Africans, its human cargo, that had departed Luanda, Angola, only months before. Now that we know that the ship called the San Juan Bautista departed Luanda, Angola, we have a better understanding of the origins of the 1619 Africans in Virginia. Luanda was, and still is, the capital of Angola, but not at the time the current larger nation-state, but then a narrow territory along the Atlantic coast in West Central Africa. Angola then was a Portuguese colony, whose name was an Iberian corruption of a local name for king or ruler. Luanda was founded as a fortified town, similar to Jamestown, on a narrow spit of land by the Portuguese in 1576. It was a beachhead for colonization and trade, but most of this trade involved the sale and transport of human beings. Slavery was not introduced by the Portuguese or other Europeans. It was a practice known to and carried out by Africans on the continent for centuries. Africans enslaved other Africans for generations, no different than Europeans had enslaved and conquered other Europeans in their history. While many anthropologists and historians have debated the nature, hardship, and length of servitude of African domestic slavery versus transatlantic slavery, and people today debate the degree of responsibility various peoples have toward slavery, a practice that still exists in pockets of the globe today. Let's be clear. No one of any culture, at any time, wanted to be enslaved. So what changed West Central Africa from the late 15th century onwards was the degree and volume of slavery when the Portuguese first arrived in the 1480s. The West Central Africa that the Portuguese encountered in the 1480s was far more stratified and less diverse in language, custom, and religion than in West Africa to the north. The 2 most powerful kingdoms in West Central Africa were Congo and Ndongo, 2 kingdoms often at war that today remain tense, with modern Angola and the Democratic Republic of the Congo remaining rivals. The Congo Kingdom established relations with Portuguese traders early, selling its captives to Cape Verde and Portugal itself, trading for European goods, and sending the sons of its ruling class to Lisbon for education. Congo embraced Catholicism and synchronized it with local beliefs to form a hybridized form of West Central African Christianity. Congo soldiers aided the Portuguese many times, even propping up its colonies during key moments. Lisbon's African population even reached nearly 10% by 1600, largely from Congo. While relations with Portugal deteriorated somewhat by 1618, and African mercenaries seized captives from wherever indiscriminately, it is less likely that the 1619 Africans in Virginia came from Congo, as opposed to its southern neighbor and rival, Ndongo. Ndongo Kingdom and lesser states to the south were less enthusiastic about the Portuguese presence in the region. Ndongo feared Portuguese subjugation and distrusted its alliance with Congo. While Ndongo occasionally aided Portuguese forces and participated in trade, it preferred to keep the Europeans at a distance. While the Ndongo Kingdom incorporated a large area with a diverse population, most of its people were Kimbundu-speaking and lived in the heavily populated region between the Lukala and Lutete rivers. The royal district around the capital of Kabasa was a mixture of rural and urban centers, an agricultural region that grew sorghum and millet and raised livestock and worked metals. Its capital, Kabasa, was a mid to large-sized city by European standards. Ndongo largely retained its indigenous religious beliefs and was slow to embrace Christianity, along with its general mistrust of all things Portuguese, although there was a small Jesuit presence in Kabasa. Ndongo also had some of its territorial claims seized by the Portuguese to create its Angolan colony. To make matters worse, as the Portuguese became more aggressive by 1618, Ndongo's ruling family was politically fractured. It was in a vulnerable position to be attacked. Imbangala Kulanji had outraged his Ndongo nobles through crimes committed by family members through his many wives and was overthrown. His son Ngola Mbandi was insecure and ineffective and had not coalesced his sobas, or local rulers, under his influence. He was the brother of Queen Jinga from our last video series, who later overthrew him. Meanwhile, the Portuguese crown had instructed its Angolan governors and traders to seek peace, avoid African wars, stop the practice of hiring African mercenaries, and focus on trade and missionary work. The new governor of Angola, who arrived in Luanda in 1617, promised to abide by these orders. His name was Luis Mendes de Vasconcelos. Mendes was a military man who quickly saw Ndongo as an enemy and an impediment, an enemy because of their defeat of the Portuguese in 1589, and an impediment because of his vision to conquer Central Africa from Angola on the Atlantic coast eastward to the new colony of Mozambique along the Indian Ocean. But Mendes could not rely on Portuguese soldiers to achieve his military goals alone. European soldiers often proved unreliable in West Central Africa and had suffered many defeats and succumbed to disease. Mendes instead recruited and revived the controversial practice of relying on mercenaries, in this case, the mysterious Imbangalas. The origins of the Imbangala are vague. Their exploits and tactics were controversial. Their range, impact, and success are debated amongst historians. Their legacy today in Angola remains complicated. The Imbangala are first recorded in the late 16th century by a European that was captured by them. Even while allowing for exaggerations and cultural bias, it is clear that both Europeans and Africans feared this stateless group that emerged out of the central highlands of Angola around the 1590s. Africans saw these marauders as witches and cult-like. No one was born in Imbangala, as all babies born from their women were killed. Imbangala warriors recruited from amongst its captured boys, who wore a collar until they made their first kill. They were even reported to have cannibalized their enemies, and they terrified all who opposed them. Imbangalas raided for plunder and profit. They didn't tap trees for palm wine, they cut them down, seized its sap, then destroyed them. They sold their captives, they did not kill or use. They were quick, well-disciplined, and fearless warriors. They were loyal to no state. In other words, Imbangalas have parallels to Aztec warriors, Spartans, Vikings, Huns, and Mongols, armies whose reputations as unstoppable killing machines combine facts and legends. By the 18th century, these warriors settled down and ended their more grievous practices, later creating a reputation as resistance fighters and a name to strike fear in all European colonizers. But in 1618, they would aid those colonizers and set themselves upon Ndongo. Mendes sent Portuguese troops, auxiliaries from his so-called Black Army, raised from local Sobas, Congo allies, and the Imbangalas. He sent them towards Cabasa. They raided the capital and took hundreds of captives. The following year, in 1619, under Mendes's son, the Portuguese and their allies struck again with a larger and more sustained force. The Imbangala used, much like the famous Zulu, a horns of a bull tactic. These warriors would strike from the sides before charging in the center with the bulk of their army. Often opposing warriors would flee from the onslaught, while the Imbangala would capture those behind the army, such as women, children, and those soldiers not fast enough to escape. A disproportionate number of Angolans enslaved in the New World, in both Spanish and Portuguese America, were women and children. Imbangala tactics might be one of the reasons why. Ndongo's weaknesses were exposed in 1619 as they lost their capital and many of their subjects to enslavement. It was meant to subjugate them. Instead, Queen Jinga emerged and overthrew her brother and began the resistance, retaking her land and its capital. She resisted the conquest of her people during her over 30-year reign. Ironically, she embraced the Imbangala ethos to do this and is known today as the mother of modern Angola. But this did not help the Ndongo captives of 1618 to 1619. They were force-marched, while bound, hands and feet, hundreds of miles to await transport at Luanda. There were so many captives from Governor Mendes's war that the slave pens were overcrowded and many were held on the beaches. These captives, those who had not already died from the march, saw strange faces of European priests sprinkling water on them, speaking in strange tongues, but sometimes in Kimbundu, about a new God and faith. There, they may have been given new names. There were 36 slave ships that set sail in 1619 for the Americas from Luanda. Some went to Portuguese Brazil, while other ships had contracts to sell Africans to the Spanish Caribbean, as Spain and Portugal now shared the same monarchy and a dual empire. The San Juan Bautista had a contract to sell Africans in Mexico to ultimately work the Spanish silver mines at Zacatecas. 300 plus Africans would board. They would be chained and treated as cargo. Nearly a third would perish in the brutal Middle Passage. The rest would encounter another terror as their ship was bombarded by English privateers in the months ahead. Of these, 32 would end up in Virginia, 9 at Jamestown, and 1 was named Angela. On this episode, we looked at the complicated origins of the first Africans and a war that took place in West Central Africa. In our next video, we're going to discuss the role of race and racism in England before 1619, where we might find some surprises. Thanks for watching.